everybody. I'm finally ready to start with episode 4. This part is going to cover the Canary Islands, the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, and we'll also get into a little bit of meeting the Taínos. It's going to be a little bit complicated because there is a lot of info. I'm going to go slow because I don't want to get confused and I don't want anybody else to get confused. And I'm sorry, I have a little person with me right now. I just got her, so she's only 10 weeks and she thinks I'm her mother. So she will be all over. Again, I'm doing this because I think it's important for us as Dominicans who have been born or raised outside of the island to really understand our culture and our history. Most of us don't have a good concept of where our ancestors came from and why we are who we are. So that is why I'm doing this, and I hope you continue to enjoy the information that I'm getting for you. I'm doing a lot of research, which I enjoy. I love doing it. And so let's just hop to it. So just recapping as to why I'm talking about the Canary Islands when I'm talking about Dominican history. So the Canary Islands are basically our big brother. They were invaded and conquered before the Dominican Republic was. So that's why in order to understand our history, we need to go further back and understand how this even started so that we can later on put everything together and realize why we do what we do. Where do a lot of our customs and traditions come from? So as you can tell from the map, this is Africa, the continent of Africa. Africa actually has 54 countries, thousands of tribes. So up here is Spain, Portugal. These little dots right here are the Canary Islands. So they are a group of 7 islands off the coast of Africa near present-day Morocco, Western Sahara, Mauritania. And we've known, or the world at the time knew about them, about these islands, but they were called the Fortune Islands at the time. This was around 40 BCE. So through Juba II, so this is Juba II. He was king of the North African states of Numidia and Mauritania. And he was the one who originally explored these islands that came to be called the Canary Islands because of the large amount of canines. I thought it was the bird. Honestly, I thought it was the bird, but it's the dogs, canines, that were found on the island. His wife was Cleopatra Selene II, who was the daughter of the famous Mark Antony of Rome and the even more famous Cleopatra VII of Egypt. She greatly influenced her husband's, Juba's, decisions, political decisions, and supported him in the expedition that eventually found the Canary Islands. And we know about this expedition because of 2 Greek writers, Plutarch and Pliny the Elder. They wrote about his expedition. So about 1,000 years after Juba visited the Canary Islands, the Arabs began visiting and trading on the islands, in particular the one named La Gran Canaria. Another 300 years would go by before we would get the Portuguese, the Italian Genoese, the French explorers visiting the island. So their official recorded contact with Europeans was about 1325 when the Genoese men landed on the island. They built a castle and they immediately began enslaving the natives. So in 1341, the King of Portugal at the time was named King Alfonso IV, And he was, and this is a quick side note I thought was interesting. He was the father of King Peter the First, Pedro of Portugal, who is known really for the tragic love story with his mistress Inés de Castro. Do you know this story? So really quickly, Alfonso did not like the relationship between them two, so he had Inés de Castro murdered. Peter obviously was extremely distraught, mad, angry, all of them. So when he became king, he had her exhumed, put her in coronation gowns, and had all of his courtiers kiss her hand, her dead hand. Yeah, that's power right there. Or at least that's what the legend says. So Alfonso, getting back to Alfonso the Fourth, he's also actually one of the great, I don't know which great grandfather of our Juan the Second from Portugal. Remember Juan? Yeah, he's also related to him. So he actually sent Nicoloso de Rico, who was another Italian explorer way before Christopher Columbus showed up on the scene, south to the Canaries. So from what is known, one of the treasures that could be found on these islands was something called orcho or orco. It's a prized like dye violet color that's produced from the local lichen. And this was like in high demand in the Iberian cloth industry at the time. So according to environmentalist historian or environmental historian Alfred W. Crosby, De Rico took a cargo of skins, fats, and oils, dyestuffs, and a few slaves from the indigenous population from the islands. I think it was about 4. I read that somewhere. And he returned to Portugal. And this cargo wasn't impressive enough for the Portuguese to continue sponsoring trips to the island. It doesn't mean that there weren't other people visiting the island. We have the French, some Spanish, even Scots visiting, but none of them established like permanent settlements in the 14th century. But because this explorer, this Italian explorer, Nicoloso de Rico, took these people from this island, we can actually push back the official date of Conquest of 1402 about almost 100 years back, because he took these people into slavery. And not only him, we know that others that visited also took and transported hundreds, if not thousands, of natives into the Iberian Peninsula. So we can safely say that the age of conquest actually started about 100 years before in the 1300s and not in the 1400s, as a lot of people believe. So who actually claimed these islands for the Spanish? So John de Betancourt, this dude right here, and Gadifer de la Salle, they were or considered the conquerors of the Canary Islands. So they set sail to the Canary Islands from La Rochelle, France on May 1st, 1402 in a joint venture. The two explorers had obtained a bull, or a bull being basically an important document from the Pope. And they got this document from the anti-Pope Benedict the 13th. In case you don't know, an anti-Pope in the Roman Catholic Church is just someone who opposes the legitimately elected Bishop of Rome and tries to secure the papal throne. And to some degree, they succeed. So that's why they're called the anti-Pope. So this Pope was granting indulgences, which is basically forgiveness, partial or in full, for your sins, to anyone who participated in the conquest of these islands. So they arrived in the island about a month later in June, and they started to lose supplies. They didn't have what they needed, and the men that were with them started to rebel. So Betancourt told Gadifer, hey, you know what? I'm going to go to Spain and see if they'll help us. He returned 18 months later and declared himself king of the Canary Islands. So episode 4, part 2. So again, I'm covering the Canary Islands early history because they're actually our big brother and their history is actually our history. So I'm going over it rather briefly. I'm not going to get too in depth. I'm going to cover just what I feel is important to our better understanding of where our customs and traditions come from. So John here had just come back from Spain trying to get supplies for his rebellious group of crewmates. And he came back with the title of King of the Canary Islands, which had been bestowed on him by Henry III of Castile after he had paid homage to him. In other words, he had changed alliances from the French to the Spanish. But his mate over here, his partner, was not happy with what he had done, and he basically abandoned him. In the 18 months that he had been gone, Gadifer had actually taken possessions of the islands that we now called Lanzarote and Fuerteventura. So Gadifer, being faithful to the French crown, went back to France. Baudegard, obviously, he did not care. He just kept going, and he added the island of Ferro to his tally of conquests, and he also ended up bringing people over as the Spanish, I'm gonna say this, like the Spanish tradition of just like kicking people out of their homelands as they did with the Moors and the Jews, and then brought peasants down from the north. They kind of did a similar thing. They obviously conquered and took into slavery many of the indigenous people, so they needed people to populate the area. So he brought Norman and Basque peasants, and a lot of people that do their ancestry DNA will find Basque ancestry. My mother was one of them. And this can be a sign that you are actually descendant from somebody from the Canary Islands. So just to make it clear, they originally had the patronage of the French in 1402, but then France le sacó la pata, and they're like, we're not giving you any more money. So that's why John over here decided to go to Spain to get financial support. So something interesting that I found about Henry III of Castile, or Enrique el Doliente, he became king at 11 years old. So he was put under a regency, meaning that someone older, supposedly more wiser than him, would reign until he came of age. During that regency was when a lot of anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish sentiment happened, and the Jewish communities were sacked as the result of this administration. He came into full power at the age of 14, and he restored complete control to the monarchy of all the councils and the courts. He struggled with Portugal, and he was successful. And he also sent emissaries to different Asian emperors. He was a very, very skilled and savvy teenager. But because he was constantly in ill health, he died very young, and he left an heir, John II, Isabel's father, as heir, but he was only 2 years old. Again, a regency was formed between Henry III's widow and his brother, and as always, it was a mess, but I'm not going to get into that. But this was the king that Jean Betancourt gave his alliance to, and this was how the Canary Islands ended up under Spanish rule. Betancourt actually left the governorship of the island to his nephew, Massoit de Betancourt, but this kid in 1448 sold the lordship or the overall rulership of the island to the Portuguese and to Prince Henry the Navigator. So this obviously caused chaos, and it was a huge crisis, a revolt that ended up lasting until 1459 when the Portuguese were finally kicked out of the islands. It wasn't until though 1479, so 20 years later, that Portugal finally recognized the Castilian control over the Canary Islands through the Treaty of Alcazovas. I hope I said that right. I'm not entirely sure. So something that came to identify Spanish conquest was sugar. And over the next century, the Canary Islands actually prospered as a result of sugar cultivation. Some people might not know this, and I thought this was interesting. Sugarcane is actually a type of grass that is native to Asia. And Europeans came to know about sugar during the Crusades in the 800s and the 900s. I love Bailey Sarian. If anybody knows her, she does murder, mystery, and makeup on Mondays. Well, most Mondays. She also does a show or a podcast, right, called Dark History, and she actually did an episode on sugar and covered these facts. So eventually, the sugar industry made these islands extremely attractive. The first sugar mill was actually on Gran Canaria, and it was built in 1484. It became the most important export of the island, and it just transformed it, as well as it would eventually the Caribbean islands, including the Dominican Republic. Alfred W. Crosby, he's the author of The Columbian Exchange and The Ecological Imperialism. He details the resulting deforestation of the Canaries under the reign of the sugar plantations, and also I have to say it this way, just the unquenchable thirst for labor. And as we'll see a little bit further down, because of certain laws that were passed that made it somewhat difficult, not completely difficult, to enslave the indigenous population in order to force them to produce this sugar, it resulted in the importation of slaves, in particular, African slaves. The Canary Islands became a stopover. The place you stopped, el escala, ¿verdad? Cuando uno va para la República, que uno no quiere coger aviones con escala. Esta era la escala, the Canary Islands. This was their stopover for merchants and immigrants leaving to the New World. And Columbus, on all 4 of his trips, stopped at the Canary Islands. So the Castilians continued to dominate the islands. Remember, there were 7 of them. And due to the geography of the islands and also the resistance of the natives of the Guanches, there wasn't a complete control over the islands until about 1495, when Tenerife, I want to say it right, y La Palma were finally conquered by Alonso Fernandez de Lugo. Alfonso eventually actually took and presented the captured native kings of Tenerife to Ferdinand and Isabella. This image here is supposedly that happening. So here's Alfonso, here are the native kings, and here is Fernando and Isabella. So the islands on this side of the African continent, like the Canaries and Cabo Verde or Cape Verdean islands, became the first stop for a lot of Europeans who then sailed all over the world. It's interesting to note that dogs, sheep, goats, pigs, barley, wheat, and peas were already on the island. The Europeans would then add cattle, donkeys, camels, rabbits, pigeons, chickens, hens, ducks, grapevines, melons, pears, apples, and most important, like we said, sugar. And this is important to note because the first horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, and honeybees to arrive in America were likely transported first from the Canary Islands. So the fortunes of the Canaries started to change during the 18th century when its economy, still dependent on sugar, came under competition of Spain's new locations of sugar in the Caribbean. From 1840 to 1890, thousands of Canary Islanders immigrated to Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba. So now that we have the basics of the Canary Islands and its conquest. We can talk more about the natives. So, of the several islands off the coast of Africa, the Canaries were the only islands that had indigenous people inhabiting them. So, we talked about the Spanish, the Portuguese, the explorers, but who were the natives? So, the natives, currently known as Guanches, were actually different people or tribes of Berber origin. So, the same origin as the Moors that conquer Spain for 800 years? Yeah, those people. They inhabited the island until the Kingdom of Castile conquered them or invaded them between 1402 and 1496. We know their genetic origin because they practiced mummification, so we found mummies. But currently, scholars don't believe that they themselves knew where they came from. Although they all had common roots, each island had its own laws, its own customs, which obviously made them have their confrontations between them and with the future conquistadores. So if you notice here are the islands. These are the original indigenous names for these islands with the original indigenous people from each island. So there are about 8 tribes. They lived very simply, herding goats and sheep. They had kings who ruled over them, but we don't know a lot about their social structure except what obviously the Europeans cared to share. So we really have to take their descriptions with a grain of salt. So the people that the Spanish found in the Canaries had brown complexions, blue or gray eyes, and blondish hair. And most of the these characteristics still exist today in the people who currently inhabit the island, but they're barely distinguishable in appearance or culture from the people of Spain. This image here is supposedly a reconstruction of one of the mummies that they found on the island. So I feel like this is in my opinion and from all the articles I have read. I agree with what Laura Lewis, the author of Hall of Mirrors, Power, Witchcraft, and Caste in Colonial Mexico, actually argues. And I'm going to apply it to the Guanches because I feel that it kind of connects better. So she wrote that while Indians were given a social political designation, Africans were labeled with the color term, negro. So the Spanish thus saw Indios as something like themselves. But about blacks, they were more ambivalent. And I honestly believe that this was the case because look at them. I feel that this caused a really, really big problem. Because even though racism, as we know racism now, wasn't established yet, it was already beginning. The Portuguese had already transported several Africans to the Iberian Peninsula by this time, and slavery, as we know, had always existed. It was part of the actual framework of society at the time. However, their interaction with the Guanches caused a very big moral problem. Dr. Emily Berquist Soul of California State University in Long Beach explains really well the problem that arose. So she states in her essay that from the 8th century on, the Spanish and Portuguese gained extensive experience in fighting, subjugating, and enslaving the North African Muslims who had invaded Iberia starting in 710. But as we now have come to know, the Arabs were already making a distinction between their white slaves that were more expensive and their black slaves who were more economical. So even though originally there was a huge interest from the Catholic authorities to convert them, like that was the purpose of these expeditions, Sailors and pirates searching for supplies and trade items that landed on this island quickly realized that they could repay their creditors by enslaving the natives. So because the Catholic kings at this time were very, very much interested in what their Pope had to say, the Pope at the time was named Innocent IV. And he concluded that they didn't have a right to come into other people's lands and just take over. And this was way before Isabel and Ferdinand. Like, this was way before any of them were around. This dude, Innocent, said, you know what? People in their own lands have a right to exist, but spiritually, human beings are subject to the rule of Jesus Christ. This is from Dr. Emily's paper. And so the Pope claimed their spiritual jurisdiction over all humans, who were consequently divided into two groups. So Christians already part of the church and everyone else. So he stated that infidels or people outside of the Catholic Church simply living under their own rules in their own societies were not in violation of any natural law. Therefore, invading their territory, enslaving them, and seizing their lands was not sanctioned. In other words, it was not okay to do. But of course, human beings will always find a way of screwing their neighbors. So they got themselves a new political party. Pope Benedict VII in 1403 gave out a bull, remember a bull, an important document from the Pope, saying that now the invasion of the Canary Islands was a religious war. They were trying to convert these heretics. And now, under the laws of a religious war, they were game for being captured and enslaved. The only way that they could escape enslavement was to convert to Catholicism. But you know what the funniest thing was? That they would read these declarations to these native people who didn't speak a lick of Spanish, saying in Spanish, if you accept our God, blah, 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 you will be treated respectfully and you will be equal part in the government or equal part citizen as a subject. But they didn't understand any of that. Like, it was ridiculous. Even contemporaries, people living during the time were like, this is this is stupid. Why are you reading that to them? They don't understand it. So the pressure was on, and they just continued to just change political parties using the popes. So this one was Pope Eugene IV. In 1434, he reinforced the bull, or the important document, right? Saying that you couldn't enslave these native peoples, okay? And if they did, they would risk excommunication, and in their eyes, excommunication meant being sent to hell. And because these islands had already been conquered, or most of it, right, by 1434, he said that the islands that had already received the word of the gospel could not be touched. They could not enslave these people. However, those that hadn't received the missionary effort were fine. So Eugene, quote unquote, said, "One and all who attempted to capture or sell or subject to slavery any baptized residents of the Canary Islands could be excommunicated." He also explained why he put this in place. Some Europeans, so this is a quote, "Some European Christians have approached the islands by ship and with armed forces taken captive and even carried off to lands overseas, many persons of both sexes taking advantage of their simplicity, and worse, others were even at times tricked and deceived by the hope and promise of baptism and then sold into perpetual slavery." So by 1462, Pope Pius II realized that the European slave trade was inhibiting the conversion of Catholicism with the natives. So he said, whether they are from the Canaries or Guinea, from sub-Saharan Africa, they will have their freedom restored to them. He said that the Europeans had to free their slaves between 20 days or risk excommunication. So episode 4, part 4. So to sum up last part, we were talking about how all these papal bulls were being given out left and right about if it was okay or not okay to enslave the natives. And currently I'm talking about these natives, the natives of the Canary Islands, also known as the Guanches. And they were the first of the islands to be enslaved. So slavery, again, did not depend on race. It was more of ideology, honestly. And it depended on who was Pope at the moment. So something extraordinary that I found while researching, and I came across this through Dr. Emily, let me get her name right, Emily Berquest Soul of California State University in Long Beach. I thought it was so interesting, and I did not know this at all, that the indigenous slave trade really took off almost as at the exact same time as the African slave trade. Again, as we've noted, it's been happening for centuries on both sides because indigenous people also practice slavery. However, the reason that it just exploded was because of these papal bulls. And these papal bulls were given in opposite, completely contradictory directions. So we had the Spanish ones saying, oh no, this is not okay. You shouldn't enslave these people. And then we had the Portuguese ones from 1452 and 1455 that were authorizing the complete opposite about enslaving indigenous people, but in particular enslaving Black Africans. So a lot of these requirements had to do with birthplace or with residency. So if they were on the Canary Islands, no matter if they were Black or not, they couldn't be enslaved as long as they converted to Catholicism. But again, these dudes would play it out. As long as they could say that the indigenous population was rejecting Catholicism, they would enslave them. They were gone. So again, as long as they were supposedly under Castilian governorship, slavery was not supposed to be an option for them. And these were laws. So the whole conquest of the Canary Islands, the issues with it, were already in play when Ferdinand and Isabel became king and queen. And their policies with them actually transferred to the natives in the Dominican Republic. In 1477 was the first time that the issues with enslavement of the indigenous people really came to the forefront for Ferdinand and Isabella. When Ferdinand Peraza, he was the Spanish lord of the island of Gomera, and he captured 1,000 Gomero natives and then took them to the Andalusian slave market, meaning he took them to Spain to sell them as slaves. When Bishop Juan de Frias learned about what was going on with these natives, he immediately said, no, they can't be sold. They're Christians. He went to the royal court and asked publicly for Isabella, the queen, to free these natives. Isabel ordered the sale to be stopped. And she put in a commission, so a group of people to kind of investigate the matter. And the commission actually declared them Christian, and that, yeah, they couldn't be sold. They needed to be freed. We now know that Queen Isabella had a soft spot in her heart for the natives. And she actually declared this: we're going to give our support and help to the holy conversion of the infidels who are in the Canaries and Africa and in the whole ocean sea. And in that same year, 1477, a few months later, she declared the liberty of the Canary Islanders, who are Christians, are converting to our holy Catholic faith or are converting, and they are not to be sold or transferred or distributed. The 1,000 Gomeros, we assume that they all survived the trip, that was supposed to be sold were actually transferred to the care of Bishop Frias, who then returned them to the Canary Islands in 1478. It sounds great, right? But again, there's always a but. They were returned to the Canary Islands, but they were then used as intermediaries to continue the conversion process. This campaign then was converted into an all-out war with cannons, with soldiers, with horses, engaging the natives in battle for the next 5 years. 10 years later, the Gomeros had enough, and they actually killed Peraza, the one who originally had captured the 1,000 that he took to Spain. And this was during a very, very violent uprising. The Catholic kings saw this as an ungrateful action by the indigenous people. And they said, oh, you want war? War you'll get. And in the end, they were again enslaved. So by 1489, there were ships just beaming with slaves from the Canary Islands, and they were brought to Andalusian and Mediterranean slave markets to be sold. Again, Isabel and Ferdinand came to their rescue and declared that they were free Christian vassals and that they could not be enslaved. So this is in 1490, around the same time that they're butting heads with the Muslims down south. But by the time that they declared this again, the Gomeros that were captives and were enslaved in Spain actually had to go through the courts and gain legal freedom. They had to do this individually, and it was a very complex system, because you know what they wanted them to prove? They wanted them to prove that they were native. They wanted them to prove that they were natives, indigenous people. And this is the same thing that happened to indigenous people from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and all the other areas that they conquered. So in order to keep them enslaved, a lot of them were told that they were Africans. That, no, you're not an indigenous person. You were from Africa, and so were your family members. So this gave rise to how important it was to distinguish themselves and to keep their culture in order to prove that they were natives of the original lands. So by the early 16th century, so the 1500s, the Canary Islanders were no longer enslaved. They weren't transported to Europe. They weren't put into this treatment. However, what did happen to them was something that happened to the indigenous people of the Dominican Republic, which was paper genocide. So by 1496, their 9 kingdoms had all fallen to the Castilian crown. Many of the Guanches who were not killed during these invasions, as already stated, they were sent to slavery in the peninsula. And those who weren't sent were forced to assimilate to the culture and the religion of the conquistadores. So now Spain, and we can say Europe, had an example to go by as to how to proceed in their conquest of future islands. So they went in this order. Slavery was first. Let's conquer and enslave. Genocide, it would follow with the whole disease, radical transformation of the land, and exploitation of its resources. So from this mixture of indigenous and Spanish and Portuguese and French, a new society was created. Those that immigrated later on in the 1800s to the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Cuba, etc., brought with them things like gofio, guisado de carne de chivo, sancocho, bacalao, and posiblemente mango también. So these mixes, even though it came by through horribly violent ways, gave rise to other things that we now enjoy. It's insane. But I will continue on giving a brief timeline of the actual African slave trade and also of the free Africans that emigrated on their own to our islands. So episode 4, part 5. So now that I got through the Canary Islands, how their experience is our background as Dominicans because they are our big brother. Now I'm going to cover the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade because many of us are confused with the American version. And even though all slavery in the Americas started the same way, which is what we're going to cover, it didn't all begin at the same time. So here's a quick timeline of the slave trade. So 1480s, the Portuguese populate their island colonies off the coast of Western Africa, largely with enslaved Black Africans. The Portuguese also take many African captives back to Portugal. In the 1500s, we have Spain and Portugal establishing colonies. In the 1600s, we have the Dutch, English, and French establishing colonies. And then August 1619, we have the first Africans in English America are brought to the Jamestown colony in Virginia. So slavery in the Dominican Republic started much earlier than it did in the Americas. It started right with the arrival of Columbus. But something that we have to understand about slavery is that there's different kinds of slavery. The American version is the one that most of us here heard and know about, which is chattel slavery. So this form of slavery, chattel slavery, means the following. It is a system which allows people to be considered legal property. That means that they could be bought and sold and owned forever, for their whole lives. This form of slavery was not actually common before the American slave trade began. But the United States and most European powers began to support this form of slavery and continued to support it between the 16th and the 18th centuries. This article here from Time Magazine from August 20, 2019 by Olivia B. Waxman explains in the blue, it says, laws on lifetime slavery, including the law that said children of enslaved mothers are slaves, didn't start to appear until the late 17th century and early 18th century. So the other form of slavery that was much more common and is even spoken about in the Bible is called indentured servitude. So indentured servitude was basically that you signed a contract saying, I'm going to work for you for free for X number of years. And usually people did this in order to come over to the New World or to the Americas. They would willingly go into this contract where they became slaves for a certain number of years. The slave plantation of Zephaniah Kingsley in the Dominican Republic was an example of that. He originally immigrated to the colonies in the 1700s and then eventually ended up in the Dominican Republic. He owned several indentured servants of dark skin who eventually were granted their freedom. The point being that there was so many different forms of slavery that they were able to use to continue to keep people in bondage. Mind you, he also had regular chattel slavery as well, included in his mix of commercial endeavors and whatnot. He wasn't a cool dude. That's what I'm trying to say. But when chattel slavery was being threatened, he used indentured slavery in order to continue to practice slavery on his plantations. Another form was bonded slavery, which is basically very similar to indentured servitude, where the person is paying off something. It's a form of debt slavery. And this continues to this day. People are still being enslaved. Currently, the estimate is that there's about 40 million people currently in 2023, currently in some form of slavery. And let me not forget forced labor. That's another form of slavery. We know that there's other forms that I'm not going to mention here that are just horrible and goes on every day. But we do have to understand something really important. So as Dr. Emily Buquest Soul of California State University, in her paper, she makes note of this. I don't know if I mentioned before, but her paper is named From Africa to the Ocean Sea, Atlantic Slavery in the Origins of the Spanish Empire, Atlantic Studies. So this is on page 16, and I'm going to read textually because I think it's really, really important. So here's the text in case you want to read it, screenshot it. But it says the following. Of course, no matter how it is defined, Amerindian slavery or indigenous slavery was fundamentally different from African slavery. Legally, it was not chattel slavery, whereby the slave became the lifetime movable property of the owner. It was easier for Amerindians to blend in to colonial society, either through passing or through marriage or personal relationships. In other words, not all the Spanish and Portuguese were white or white-skinned, light-skinned. The Amerindians could blend in. Amerindian slavery was always contested, often by powerful and prominent representatives of the Catholic Church. African slavery, in contrast, would not be openly contested. She continues saying that as soon as Columbus returned from the New World, all of these territories were considered part of the Spanish crown. So these Indians or indigenous people were considered subjects. They were citizens of these invaders. So she states broadly the experience of the Amerindian slaves in colonial Spanish America, so Puerto Rico, La República, Cuba, etc., mirrors that of the natives of the Canary Islands. So some of them were exempted from slavery while others were exploited by the various exceptions to the laws that they passed trying to protect the indigenous people from slavery. So those who were captured and brought later from sub-Saharan Africa were from lands where the Spanish crown didn't have any actual say, so they could not be trusted. So the Iberian invaders saw the indigenous people in a different light because they believed, and they seem to be the Lulu all the time, that because they had given the indigenous people a choice to become part of the Spanish Empire, that they basically had some sort of affinity for them. And even though the Africans that were forced into slavery were later on also baptized and converted to Catholicism, etc., etc., because of the way they were taken, the Spanish were very well aware that they probably did not have great feelings towards them. By describing them as negros, they made it very clear that, as Emily says, they were people without a home, a culture, or history. So just to be clear, the Europeans did not start the slave trade. The Arabs started it. The Europeans also participated in it amongst themselves. But in Africa, the Africans in particular already had a slavery system established way before the Europeans arrived. They used slavery to get rid of their prisoners of war. Their prisoners, even though they were also dark-skinned, they had no political or moral obligations to them, to their enemies. They saw them as they were another nation, another people. The Portuguese then tapped into this system and commercialized it, meaning that they made it available to others through open markets to be bought and sold. And that's when it boomed.